Hello and welcome to another episode of From Borderline to Beautiful. I hope you are enjoying the summer and staying safe, especially if you have some of the effects of the fires or even are in the midst of the fires that have been occurring this week. Now, this week, I would like to talk about something that I know I did a lot in recovery that stunted my growth and was an obstacle to my ability to take perspective and to really connect with other people, to be vulnerable and to deepen my relationships. And those were all the things I wanted. All I wanted was to not be left and not be abandoned. And yet I had had all of these shields up that actually made this want or need to not be abandoned, this self-fulfilling prophecy many times. And one of those shields that I had up was not willing to be vulnerable and being judgmental. I was a very judgmental person. And I wanted to come today and talk about judging other people and the consequences of that and how it can connect with being a block to your shadow work. Shadow work is something that I've talked about a few times on the podcast, and I'm doing it with my clients often because it is just so powerful and so meaningful. So, what is judging someone, or let's define that? What do I mean by that? It's expressing a critical opinion or evaluation about someone or something. And it's typically based on perceived traits, behaviors, their motives, or their works, their worth, right? So, why is it a problem to bring judge or not work on your judgmentalism or judging other people in your recovery work? It wouldn't seem like it's that big of a deal, right? Because isn't the goal to love yourself, to be compassionate with yourself? Um, yes, sure, but yes, and right? I think that there is an element of recovery that does require us to learn how to love other people well, because oftentimes those judgments are a self-protective mechanism, because oftentimes those judgments, they serve to protect us, and they frequently involve projection. So let's look at the core components of judging others. We have cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and an unconscious driver. The cognitive component is when you make a quick mental label or categorization. So you say, like, oh, that person's selfish or lazy or hypocritical or too much. The emotional component of judging is that it usually carries a charge, right? You could be irritated, you could feel superior, you could feel contempt, you could feel a sense of moral outrage, or even a more subtle kind of resentment. Behaviorally, judging can stay internal, so you can have internal self-talk, or can become external. So external judging, I think we know, looks like gossip, criticism, avoidance, passive aggression. And the unconscious driver component is what we're talking about with shadow work and in Jungian terms. It judging frequently involves, like I said earlier, projection, attributing our own disowned qualities, fears, or wounds onto the other person. So, why does judging matter? Well, it harms our mental health, it harms our self image. And additionally, it harms relationships. It also harms empathy. So let me go through all of the ways that being judgy can harm you. I know I didn't know this about myself. I would be out at the store and my initial thoughts about people were really not great. I would think, "Oh, look what she's wearing. Look what he's doing. Why do they look like that? Why are they eating that? Why are they buying that? Why, my goodness." So many judgments. And in those moments, I've forgiven myself for that behavior. But in those moments, I would, if someone would point it out to me, I carried a lot of shame because the reality was is I wasn't willing to look in the mirror. But I was definitely willing to hurl rocks at other people because I felt like, well, if I did that, then maybe people wouldn't see me. I wanted to be seen, but didn't want to be seen. I know that'll make sense to you. How does judging harm our mental health? Well, it increases chronic stress. It increases anxiety because it keeps our nervous system in a reactive, threat detecting state. So we're constantly scanning for flaws in others. It fuels rumination and it fuels overthinking because the mind replays judgment and confrontations that you're imagining. Do you ever do that? Do you ever get mad at someone and you find yourself just imagining the confrontation, what you would say, what you would do? It also contributes to depression through that suppressed shadow material that leaks out as self criticism, as inner conflict. Judging harms our mental health by heightening our emotional reactivity and splitting, which is common for us with BPD. This makes having a stable mood very difficult. It drains mental energy that could go towards healing or creativity or even values based living, which I talk a ton about on the podcast. Having a moral framework is so important. Judging also reinforces shame cycles. Judging others triggers self judgment. Saying things like, I shouldn't be so judgmental, which deepens guilt. How does judging others harm me? How does judging others harm our self image? It creates a fragile, defended identity that relies on being better than others instead of grounded in self respect. So if I would see someone, a lot of my judgmental thoughts were based around how other people looked, their weight, their clothing, whatever. And if I would see someone as like I would sort of judge their clothing or how big they were or what they were eating or whatever, I would automatically compare it to myself. And so I would be externalizing my validation in many ways. And I could have spent a lot of that time instead of judging other people, looking inward and asking myself what I needed to live a healthy life. Judging also blocks shadow integration, which is going to leave those disowned parts of ourselves, like our insecurity, our anger, our neediness, in the unconscious. What is that going to do? It's going to erode our ability to have an authentic confidence in ourselves. It's going to lead to feelings of being an imposter. Also, it's going to help us, or it's going to cause us to remain fragmented, which is why I think it's so important to talk about on the podcast, because the borderline brain is fragmented and we want to individuate. We want to become a whole person so that we can have that consistency and that fulfillment and live purpose driven lives. And how does it do that? It's because the good self image must be constantly protected by tearing others down. It distorts our self perception. And if you have these harsh external standards, they're going to get turned inward, which amplifies perfectionism and also self criticism. Judgmentalism slows personal growth because you can avoid discomfort or owning of weaknesses. That's what I was talking about my own battle with that. It would keep me stuck in an old loop instead of trying to choose healthy living and nurture myself and soothe myself. I didn't want that discomfort. I didn't want to do that hard work. I was scared. And so I would turn on other people. It also undermines vitality, it undermines self compassion, and it makes it harder to feel worthy or at peace in your own skin. Judging harms relationships. How? It erodes trust and safety because people are going to sense your critical lens and then they're going to begin to hide their true selves. Even if you're not being judgmental towards your close friend group, but you're someone who speaks about other people judgmentally, it will still erode trust and safety. And it will still cause them to think, oh, if Rose is talking about them like that, Is she going to talk about me like that? It harms relationships because it triggers defensiveness and conflict cycles. The judge person often judges back or withdrawals. So if you judge your partner, they might judge back or they might withdraw. They might shut down. It also reduces emotional intimacy because projection prevents seeing the other person clearly. It's going to damage the repair and the forgiveness process in the relationship, right? Because the focus is not on repair. It's not on forgiveness. What's it on? It's on wrongness, the other person being bad. It creates isolation too, because habitual judging leads to fewer deep connections and more surface level or avoidant relationships. And it models poor behavior for our children. It reinforces generational patterns of criticism over empathy. So, how does judging others harm empathy? And remember, I'm not challenging your empathy in all areas of your life when I say these things. I'm specifically talking about the deficits in empathy that we have with the diagnosis, which is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, especially when you're having a big emotion. So, how does it harm empathy? How does it block recovery? Because it activates black and white thinking that reduces complex human beings to single negative traits. It blocks perspective taking because the emotional charge of judgment overrides curiosity and understanding. It strengthens the us versus them divide, which makes it neurologically more difficult to activate mirror neurons. We've talked about them in past podcasts, as well as compassion circuits. And it keeps you in a superior or a victim position rather than in a space where we can share humanity with others. Being judgmental interferes with the therapeutic presence. It interferes with personal healing work by prioritizing evaluation over validation. Have you ever brought a judgmental attitude towards your provider, your coach, your therapist, your counselor? It limits growth in your values based practices. And these practices emphasize humility and grace and loving others, right? It harms these interconnected cycles. And so I just want you to, um, these judging forms of judging yourself, judging others, ha- these harms, the ones that occur when you judge yourself, when you judge others, these harms that occur when you engage in judgmental behavior, they form interconnected cycles. Your mental health strain worsens your self image, which strains your relationships, which further reduces empathy and feeds more judgment. So, what's the antidote? It's catching that judgment early and using it as shadow work. Judging others is one of the clearest mirrors for shadow work and also one of the biggest things that blocks it. So, let's review a little bit. In Jungian psychology, the shadow refers to the unconscious parts of ourself that we're repressing. Maybe we're denying them, maybe we're disowning them, often because they feel unacceptable, shameful, weak, or in conflict with our conscious self image or values. These can include negative traits like anger, envy, selfishness, judgmentalism, vulnerability, or even positive ones, the ones that we've been taught to hide, like ambition or sensuality or certain strengths. So, how does judgment function as a projection? When we harshly judge others, we're frequently projecting our own disowned shadow material onto another person. We see in them something we can't or won't acknowledge in ourselves, and it's going to trigger a strong emotional reaction, right? You might criticize someone for being too needy or for being manipulative because acknowledging your own unmet needs or subtle manipulative tendencies feels threatening to your identity as a compassionate, self sufficient person. Strong irritation at someone else's arrogance, their laziness, or hypocrisy often points to where you suppress those qualities within yourself. Strong irritation at someone lying or not being disciplined, right? This ties into splitting because you can see people as all good or all bad, which is a defense that keeps shadow aspects fragmented and unintegrated. Projection is going to keep our shadow selves hidden. Instead of owning the energy inside, we are externalizing it as their problem. This creates a loop: judgment, emotional charge, reinforcement of the repression. The shadow doesn't disappear, it actually festers, showing up in self sabotage and repeated relation patterns, emotional reactivity, or even physical symptoms, which I know you know is common, especially if you're doing trauma work, if you're doing identity work. So it blocks shadow work. Shadow work is fundamentally about integration, right? That's our goal in recovery. We want to be a whole human. Bringing those hidden parts into conscious awareness and accepting them without acting them out harmfully and reclaiming their energy for wholeness. That's our goal. Judgment blocks this in four main ways. It externalizes responsibility because your energy goes towards fixing, changing, or criticizing others instead of self inquiry and self exploration. It reinforces shame and defensiveness. The very act of judging often triggers inner criticism, which adds another layer of repression. And it maintains fragmentation, which maintains the disorder in many ways. It's especially relevant for hypersensitivity, for betrayal trauma, for the identity loop, because your unintegrated shadow keeps you in reactive splits rather than in grounded presence and in alignment with your values, your moral compass. It drains vitality. That strong emotional reaction you might have, the anger, the disgust, the superiority, is your own life force. And guess what? It's being wasted on an illusion. Unaddressed shadow work fuels interpersonal conflict, prejudice, and inner strife. Unaddressed shadow projection fuels interpersonal conflict, prejudice, and inner strife, the very things that sabotage healing, sacred relationships, and the kind of authentic presence that we all value. So, what do? How can you turn judgment into shadow work? I'm going to give you some tips today. The good news is that every judgment is like a golden doorway. If you catch it, you've located your shadow. So, what do? Pause and own the projection. When you notice a strong judgment, ask yourself, what part of me feels activated here? So, how do you turn judgment into shadow work? Well, I'm going to give you some practical steps today. The good news: every judgment is like a doorway, because if you can walk through it, you can find your shadow. So, what do? Pause. Own the projection. When you notice yourself engaging in strong judgmental behavior or having a judgmental thought, ask yourself, what part of me feels activated here? What quality am I seeing that I reject in myself? And write it down. Get your phone, your note app, be raw, be honest. Feel it in your body. Projection often comes with a bodily charge. Notice a tightness, a heat, or a contraction, and stay with it compassionately instead of analyzing it away. You can do some breath work through it, breathing in just this moment like this. Pausing at the top of the breath to take another deep breath, and then breathing out just this breath. You can dialogue with that part of yourself. Journal or use active imagination. Ask yourself, what do you need? What are you protecting? Integrate that part rather than exiling it. You can also look for patterns. Track your recurring judgments. You can track them in clients and family. Look for patterns. Track recurring judgment. You can look for those in strangers, in family members, in friends, your own self talk, even. They're often going to cluster around core wounds of betrayal, of abandonment, of not knowing who you are. And then create a compassion bridge. You can remind yourself that everyone carries a shadow. Judge, not lest you be judged. It's not just moral, it is wisdom. Judging others harshly keeps your own shadow in the dark. So it's very important that you begin to work on being less judgmental or not judgmental. We're human and we all make mistakes. And sometimes it comes as our first thought, which is super sad because we're all part of this human experience, this imperfect human experience. And so to judge others puts us in this position that mucks our recovery and makes it harder to get to our final destination, which is to climb that ladder and have loving, deep, connected relationships, which, to give you some hope, you can do because it's a good prognosis diagnosis. So thank you everyone for listening. If you want to do some shadow work, if you want to connect with me, you can reach me at 844-984-7483 or 844-9-THRIVE. You can also book a session with me or with Jay on the website at thriveonlinecounseling.com. My summer group is finishing up here in a few weeks, and I will be having a group that kicks off in the mid-fall. So if you're interested in that, send me an email today before spots fill up. Thank you so much. You are loved, you are worthy, and you are created with a purpose. And we'll see you next week for another episode of From Borderline to Beautiful.